Welcome to the Fine Print, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey. I'm coming at you with an early show this morning, which I don't normally do unless I get a request. And today we're going to squeeze one in early. I do want to do my usual housekeeping here. I had some great guests recently. John Averill from the Roaring 420s Lounge in New York, also a member of the Cannabis Association of New York, talking about some of the recent news going on there in his state. Jamie Toth, if you guys didn't check out my interview with Data Witch, Jamie Toth, who's been instrumental in auditing some of the lab data from around the country, pesticide testing, really great stuff from Jamie. Doc Ray out in California, Doc Ray Genetics, great talk with, I think he was a Green Beret, Special Forces. And then we did a 420 interview with Luke Steinke from Bird's Eye Botanicals here in Vermont. And I've got some great stuff coming up on, let's see, what do we got? May 2nd, I got Christian Poxelbutt. I hope I'm saying that right. He's the co-owner of Cloud9 here in Vermont. I already had David Camara on. That was a great interview. Christian, his partner, will be joining me on Thursday. On Sunday the 5th, I've got Josh Swider from Infinite Chemical Analysis Labs coming back in California, and I think they're in Michigan as well. Tuesday the 7th, I got Drew Greco. He's out in Vegas. I've been looking for contacts in every state, and he's going to be my Nevada guy. And then I've got Corey Donahue on Thursday, and I'm going to keep that one a little quiet for now because I think me and Corey are going to have a little bit of a banger there. In the meantime, my guest tonight is a guy, and I've been trying to link up with other journalists and media figures today. That's what we got for you. He's done a lot of writing. He's covered cannabis since 2016. He's written for 538.com, High Country News, The Guardian, the Albuquerque Journal, the Tennessean. He was previously the cannabis columnist for The Stranger, and he is currently the cannabis editor for sfgate.com. Please welcome Lester Black to the show. Lester, thanks for being here, man.
Hello. Yeah, no, thanks so much for the invite, Caleb. I'm super excited to chat with you.
Cool. Before we do anything serious, would you please give us a 5-minute life story?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. My life in 5 minutes. I'll keep it to like my journalism life because I think that's probably what folks are interested in here. I'm from Seattle, but I went to school in Boston where I studied journalism, and I really got started in journalism in really traditional political journalism, reporting from the state capitol in Boston for some local newspapers. And then I got a job at a daily newspaper down in Tennessee doing city hall and cop stuff. And that was really where I learned how to do the basics of journalism. Really amazing experience down there, although it had nothing to do with cannabis. If anything, it had like the opposite to do with cannabis because they were not very cannabis friendly down there when I was there. But then I moved back to Seattle that was around 2015, and cannabis legalization was really taking off. There was already legal sales in 2014, but by 2015, the industry was really picking up. And I found as a political reporter that a lot of the stories I was writing were actually just cannabis stories because that was the topic of the day. That was what everyone was dealing with, trying to figure out how to regulate this system. And I've always been a fan of cannabis since I first discovered it in my teenage years. So I was really excited to jump into this area, both because I love cannabis and I was already a political reporter, and because it presented a topic that I had never seen before, where everyone was so wrong about cannabis and what to do with cannabis. And that was true from the journalists covering it, like me, we were wrong about things, to the legislators, lawmakers, to the industry itself. Everyone had a lot of blind spots. And when you're doing journalism, you really look for those areas. Where are those areas where information is lacking or incorrect? And that was certainly the case in cannabis in 2015 and 2016, and I think it still is today. It's a dramatically changing, dynamic industry. The products themselves are quickly changing. The laws around them are quickly changing. So it's just about the best place you can be in terms of journalism, because the stories you're writing matter even more when folks really don't know what's happening in that area. So in 2016, I started writing about cannabis in Seattle for a couple different publications, but especially The Stranger, which is their alt weekly. It's a publication is near and dear to my heart. A really amazing publication that's fostered amazing writers and done amazing journalism over the years. So I was writing for them about cannabis. I became their cannabis columnist and a staff writer there for a few years. And then from there, I just started freelancing for other national outlets. And eventually I moved down to California, and now I live in San Francisco. And I'm the cannabis editor for sfgate.com, which is a free news website that was started in the 90s by the San Francisco Chronicle. We're now really our own thing, our own website. And it's a really amazing opportunity to be their cannabis editor. I'm the first cannabis editor for sfgate.com. Really because they are a very busy website. We get over 1 million views a day. We're a general reader audience website, and trying to find out what folks in the general audience care about when it comes to cannabis is a really fun challenge. So that's what keeps me busy every day these days, is trying to figure out what's happening in California and what folks want to read about when it comes to cannabis.
And here's Chef Rodney. Hey, Rodney, thanks for tuning in. Rodney did the intro, and I got the outro loaded up today. Rodney, thanks for putting that together. But that was one thing I definitely wanted to just get a little more insight from you about, is the balance between writing stories that you find interesting and writing stories that your audience will engage with. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Lester.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. And it's something that I've seen change a lot over the course of my career in journalism. I've been doing this for, I guess, about, over 10 years, maybe 12 years. And when I started, the internet was still a side of journalism that wasn't well done. And so we didn't really use the internet very well. And now, of course, it's almost all on the internet. And when it comes to the internet, we have really good analytics to know what people are doing when it comes to our stories. So it's something that we pay very close attention to. Oh, hey, what's up, Rochelle? We pay very close attention to it at SFGate because we are a general reader audience, and it's really important to us that we have an audience. Journalism is a participatory sport. And if no one's reading your story, I'm not sure if you're doing journalism. It doesn't mean you have to have 1 million people reading it, but you need people to read it if it's journalism. And so we spend a lot of time trying to find out what people want to read about. That isn't all that I do. I do many stories that are important stories, that are stories that the public needs to learn about, that journalists need to be looking into. But I also do stories that are definitely going to get eyes on them. And so and that's the big challenge with cannabis. And this is actually a lesson to the cannabis industry that is not well learned in the industry. But most people in this country do not care about cannabis. I care deeply about cannabis. I spend all my time thinking about cannabis and interviewing people about cannabis and researching cannabis. Most people do not care about pot. And it's tough to get them to read stories about pot because they're like, you know what, I'm not doing this drug. I don't really want to. I don't really care about it. And I think the cannabis industry in general is a little bit myopic in thinking, well, I care so much about this product and cannabis and what it can do for you. So everyone else already is there. But the truth is, and we have very good insight into this because we have a busy website and we can see this, is that very few other people are there when it comes to the general audience. And so finding things that people will really read about is a challenge with pot. And it's something that is, I would say, not easy. It's been a lot of lessons over the last year and a half for me.
And here's Ronnie again. Writing is a passion of mine. People love a good, engaging story. And Ronnie, you write some great stories too. And here's Rodney again. I feel like most people don't care because they lack the proper knowledge, that and the stigma surrounding it over the years. It's still kind of taboo.
100%, Chef. Like, it's definitely both. Like, people are ignorant, right? Like, if you are dealing with, certain medical conditions, you should already know about cannabis because there's such profound evidence that can help you, but they don't. And so where I come in is how do we get them to read about it? And how do we get them to think about it? But I think you have to have that understanding when you start, right? That like people don't care. And then how do I get them to care? But if you start with people care, so I'm going to write this story that is, built around that, then they're not going to read it and they're not going to care. And the other aspect is the taboo. I deal with this all the time with readers, is that there's deep taboo around cannabis. We are, in the process of unwinding 100 years of prohibition. That doesn't happen in a year or even 10 years. And we are still in that process. And there's still many, many millions of people who have a deep stigma against this cannabis plant. And my point of view is that we need to understand that. It doesn't mean I'm happy about that or I'm accepting that as like the permanent reality, but you need to have that as your understanding when you do work in this world of communicating.
Have you interviewed any type of prohibitionists or folks like Sam or any of those organizations, parents opposed to pot or any of these type of people?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've interviewed Kevin Sabet. Is that how you pronounce it? I don't know.
No shit.
That's his last name.
You got an interview with Kevin?
Yeah, I've interviewed him. I've interviewed many people. I mean, a lot of how I do journalism is actually going out and talking to people. So especially when I was in Washington State, when there would be like agricultural communities who are trying to ban cannabis, I would drive out there and go door to door and be like, hey, like I heard that you want to ban this cannabis farm that's opening up next to you, or it's already there and now you're trying to get rid of it. Why? And so that's one of the most important things we can do as journalists is actually go talk to people and not just assume what they're thinking, but talk to them. And you hear a lot of honestly basic things that don't have as much to do with cannabis often, where it's like they don't want people around them. They don't want a new business next to them. And then you hear things that are pretty far from reality in terms of like, well, if there's a cannabis plant growing next door, then my kids are going to start doing meth. And it's like, I don't think there's evidence of that, but I'll note that in my notebook. So yeah, I spent a lot of time talking to people in the industry, but also talking to people who are what you would call a prohibitionist.
And here's Rodney. You should interview me. Ha 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 ha.
Yeah,
actually, Rodney is a great interview. Here's David Offenhart, who I haven't talked to for a while. Rescheduling should help. Before we get to your stories, do you have any thoughts on that? And I'm going to throw descheduling in there as my favorite option. But any thoughts on that, Lester?
Oh man, I have so many thoughts on rescheduling. I mean, if I'm going to get on a high horse for a second, when Obama announced that directive, he also announced these pardons, and all of the media coverage at that moment, in that week was like, oh, these pardons are happening, but they're not that important. And I was like one of the first people, I think, that was saying, who cares about the pardons? It's going to affect like 10 people. I mean, I care about it for those 10 people, but it's not bigger than that. What we should really look at is this directive for rescheduling. And, I got kind of dragged a bit on Twitter and social media because I put out this story that Biden just took the most important move any president has taken since prohibition went into effect. And what's coming out is like now everyone in the cannabis world is deeply interested in this because it is actually very impactful. In terms of, which schedule should it go to? Should it be descheduled? That's like a really complicated question. I think there's tons of evidence that cannabis fits into the same bucket in terms of legally as like alcohol and tobacco. It's like, why is it on the CSA, right? It's like not the same as like a benzo or like an opiate. Like there's very good arguments for why it should be treated completely different than Controlled Substances Act. And there's actually even really good arguments for why the Controlled Substances Act shouldn't exist because it doesn't make sense to give cops control over substances, which are really medical questions and public health questions. So, where it lands is, I think, very controversial. It's very complicated. I would say, though, back to how I started this high horse, moving to Schedule 3 is a big deal. And even though it's not where a lot of people want it to be, I think you're pretty clearly wrong if someone's saying Schedule 3 means nothing. Schedule 3 definitely means something. There are legally big changes in Schedule 3. I mean, the big one is the 280E, which most experts I speak to think that 280E goes away with Schedule 3. And there's, a number of other things, especially in the research world with Schedule 3 that are different. Should it go to, be descheduled? I think there's a strong argument for it being descheduled. Is that going to happen? Well, we already know, right? Like we saw the recommendation. They're not recommending descheduling. It's also a bit jumping, pretty far forward to think that Biden, of all people, is going to move cannabis completely off the CSA. Although, I know where advocates stand. Like you should advocate for moving the needle as close to where you want it. And so I'm not trying to criticize people who are saying deschedule. That's, I think, a valid argument. And I think as an advocate, it makes sense to argue for that.
And yeah, here's David again. Amen. It's alcohol and tobacco lining the politicians. I don't know if you mean lining the pockets, or I feel like
Yeah, I
that's
mean, they are lining the pockets and they're worried about cannabis. Like,
big
if you look around, I mean, tobacco especially is such a strange situation. With tobacco and alcohol, like it just how the federal government has treated those drugs is so unique, and so uniquely loose compared to every other drug, and especially cannabis. And when you look at the harms from cannabis, they're very, completely different ballpark than the harms from tobacco or alcohol. So it's odd.
Oxycontin or opiates.
Right. Totally.
And in Vermont, sorry to cut you off there, but in Vermont, we had one of the biggest, heroin epidemics in the country. And I feel like a lot of that was fueled when doctors started giving out Oxycontin like it was candy. But yeah,
we could jump into that. That's a big, complicated one for sure.
Well, we'll leave that for another day. But it just bothers me that where were all of those public health arguments when they were like, yeah, we're going to start giving this stuff out. So.
I mean, also, where are the public health arguments right now where like people are dying from opioids, not because they're getting prescribed opioids and then dying. They're getting them from, a contaminated drug supply on the illicit market. And by pushing everyone out of the regulated market when it comes to opioids, we're, I think, very clearly making it more dangerous. And we see this, I live in San Francisco where we have a huge fentanyl problem. And if those folks were able to get a safe supply of opiates, they wouldn't die. Like they would very, very unlikely be dying from safe opiates, but instead they're using this incredibly powerful synthetic opiate that is hard for doctors to use, let alone you to use it on foil, on Mission Street. So it's just sad, and it's certainly not public health in mind in terms of these policies, I think.
Couldn't agree more, Lester. Let's start running through your stories here. And I want to do these. I want to thank you for sending them what appears to be in chronological order. That's going to make this nice. The first one that I've got here for you is bang. Legal weed isn't the boon small businesses thought it would be. And this is December 29, 2017. And this was written in 538.com. And I'd like to just scroll down here. And I think, did I write a quote? I think I wrote a quote. Let me read your quote as well here before it says, here's a word of warning for those looking to dive headfirst into these brand new legal markets. The data behind the first 4 years of legal pot sales with drops in retail prices and an increase in well-funded cannabis growing operations shows a market that increasingly favors big businesses with deep pockets. As legal weed keeps expanding, pot prices are likely to continue to decline, making the odds of running a profitable small pot farm even longer. I'd like to get your thoughts.
I mean, this is a story that going back on my high horse, I'm just going to stay up there because that's what we're going to do. But I mean, so I wrote this story in 2017, and literally in the subhead of the story that you just showed, it says like, this is a warning to California and to every other state, but it's relevant to me because I'm in California now, and I wrote this when I was in Seattle. But I just can't. It's hard to let this go. Is that Washington and Colorado had really clear lessons as to what was going to happen when you legalize cannabis, and everyone seemed to ignore it, from the governor of California to the state lawmakers to the local leaders to the people in the industry especially. And what do we have now? Like, what do I spend my time the last year doing is writing about how the price of cannabis in California is falling and small businesses are going out of business. And I just wonder, could this have been dealt with better if folks back in 2017 and 2018 were reading stories like this and deciding, should I get into this business? Should I start a cannabis farm and get a mortgage and tie my own house to it? Is that really a smart idea when you look at what has happened? Would I create a business plan around selling cannabis for $1,500 a pound when outdoor is going for under 300 right now in California and dropping? And that was all predicted in this data. The other side of this story actually is pretty interesting, is that Washington, like all states, has the seed to sale database, which tracks, everything through cannabis. I think anyone dealing with legal cannabis knows about these databases. But the cool thing in Washington is it's all public, or it was actually. It's kind of changed a little bit because of some technical changes, but it was all public. So for reporters like me and industry analysts and people in the industry, you could request every single transaction that had happened legally in Washington and see it. And so you get these like very large databases with very strong data in terms of seeing what the price is. So, if folks want to go read that story, it is kind of cool because you can see very clearly how the prices are changing and how the sales patterns are changing in Washington. And people who are data folks, a lot of people probably already know this, but if you want to study what happens when you legalize cannabis, go request this database from the state of Washington.
Is this metric? Is this a metric database? Sorry to cut you off, but I'm curious.
It's
BioTrack.
I did so many stories about these vendors. I think it was BioTrack. It's someone else. It wasn't Metric to start. It was someone else, and maybe they got transitioned. It's kind of like traumatic for me to think about because I wrote many stories about those database of vendors back in the day. But yeah, it's a really interesting database for people to look into what happens when you legalize cannabis.
I'm going to throw a couple comments here, Chef Rodney. It's all big pharma. They even control our food. Their idea: control the food, control the people. It's how they get us to work for shit wages, even if, et cetera. They don't care if we die from ODs. Let's say that pharma stuff for later, but here's another one. LinkedIn user. Lester, what is your advice to cannabis journalists who are stuck in a PR type of role, but want to take more of an investigative, skeptical angle in their reporting? Should they leave the outlet entirely if they aren't getting traction with their leadership?
That's a really good question, and I have a difficult answer for you, but cannabis journalism in general, not just cannabis journalism, but journalism in general is in a really tough place. So I always tell journalists and aspiring journalists to look out for themselves because this industry will take advantage of you. And one story is never worth, hurting yourself or really, putting yourself in a bad place. So look out for yourself. So I wouldn't say like leave that role. Because often, a job is like safety for many of us. But if you want to do more interesting things, do more investigative things, the way to learn how to do that and to do it is by doing it, which is maybe a tough answer, but there's a lot of publications out there who do allow people to freelance for them. And so if you're like, hey, I'm in this job and all I'm doing is kind of like PR stuff that's not interesting and maybe not even true, and I want to do something more interesting, then get some story ideas together and start reporting them out, and then go to some of these independent outlets or even any of these outlets who are looking for cannabis journalism, and start pitching them and start writing them. And once you start writing and publishing, you get traction in your career. That's the only way I've ever moved my career forward. It's not by talking to people or anything. It's just by publishing stories. So look for stories and find outlets for them. And if that means, you have to do it on the side, I would do that. I would say in my career, I spent 10 years in food service throughout all of this because, because I could do food service at night, and during the day I could do journalism that I wanted to do. And it was like so tiring, but it allowed me to move forward. And so it's like finding a sustainable path for you to move forward is the most important thing. And the second most important thing is writing the stories you want to write and working on the stories you want to work on. And like finding homes for stories, don't think about like, hey, I need this story in the New York Times. It's more important just to get it out there. So if it means it's going in the Cannabis Business Times, that's great. Like if so many people read that, and if they're interested, do it for them. Because if you get that clip, then you're moving forward. And if you're stuck in like trying to pitch the best possible outlet, you're not really moving that far forward.
And great answer, Lester. Thanks for taking that one. I did just want to, before we move to the next story, I want to ask you if it sounded like this story was from 2017, December. Have you noticed any difference in the market now? Do you think that maybe now it's more favorable for small businesses, or has it gotten worse or stayed kind of the same since you wrote that story?
It's gotten like remarkably worse, I would say, anywhere I'm looking. I mean, I'm writing a story right now about how it's getting worse in California. I think, when we look forward the next 10 years, as you know, if there is federal reform, it's going to do a lot of different things. In some ways, it's going to make it harder for small businesses because you're going to have way more investment capital. People are like talking about like big cannabis right now. There is no true big cannabis right now. There's no Amazon in cannabis. But once federal legalization happens, there will be truly, you know, big business. Like you're talking like ultra mega cap business in cannabis. That's going to drive the price down further. That's going to really make it even harder. But the other side of this federal legalization is that, you know, if you can have small business loans that are actually reasonable, that really helps small businesses. If the local laws make it more favorable for small businesses by having like direct sales, that makes it more favorable. So it's a rocky road ahead, and we'll see. But I don't see it getting easy by any means anytime soon.
Word up. I'm going to move on to the next story here. We got hunting for rare cannabinoids, and this is from the stranger right here. And I don't know if I was see my notes here. Yeah, I've also talked to a number of scientists about the synthetics and also, which I think is going to tie into this. But you know, for me, when I first started smoking weed was just weed, and then in the last, you know, I don't know, it seems like maybe since you wrote the story 5-6 years, there's all these different cannabinoids. I'm learning about a million different extraction techniques, and it seems like every day it's just I'm learning something new about the plant that I might not have known. Yeah, so I'm gonna
I mean, this story, I love that I wrote this story. I'm just gonna be on my high horse this entire time. I sent you my favorite stories, so I'm
That's what I got you here for. That's what I got you here for.
But so I wrote this story in April of 2018. This is 6 months before the Farm Bill passed. At that point, like people barely knew what CBD was. People like you couldn't say cannabinoid and have people understand what you were saying. So what I saw is what you just said, Caleb. Like, you know, weed used to be weed, and that was true for me. You know, buying weed was weed. Like, what is this better weed? Is this worse weed? And maybe they have a name with it or something. But I saw in Washington's market, which was moving pretty quickly at that time, that it was no longer just weed. The most sophisticated cannabis companies were selling things like CBG, and you know, Delta 8 THC was actually showing up before the Farm Bill, and people were talking about like wanting to find THCV. People, only a very, very small group of people in the whole world was talking about THCV at that time. And they were talking about it in these ways of like truly like a hunt. Like you see the, you know, those folks from Amsterdam, strain hunters, went to Africa looking for THCV. And one of their guys died from malaria. That was how serious it was to find these things. And now it's a totally different game with the Farm Bill, with all these synthetics, which I really think we need to do a better job of separating natural cannabinoids from synthetic cannabinoids. And I know people yell at me all the time for saying it's not synthetic, it's semi-synthetic. And I think the most important thing is to tell the consumer, was this produced from a plant or was this produced in a lab? And, you know, saying something's not synthetic because there's represented in the cannabis plant, but you produced it by having a heavy acid solvent and then a crazy synthetic process. It's a synthetic cannabinoid. So this story was, I remember I submitted it to my editor and I wasn't sure if they were going to understand anything I was talking about, because in April of 2018, this just was not in the lexicon yet. And now it really is. It's like everywhere. And, you know, especially in sophisticated cannabis markets, it is like butter versus margarine. Totally. Like just because margarine is like somewhat like butter doesn't mean it's the same. And it also doesn't mean it's as good for you, right? Like people don't really use margarine anymore because we all know that it has like the worst types of fats in it. And so I think people should know that about if they're having, you know, Delta 9 THC that's been made synthetically from CBD, who knows what's in that? And maybe we'll get into this because the next story I have on my list gets into this a bit, but there's so many unknown compounds produced in these synthetic extractions and conversions really that no one knows what they do. Like they're not named in scientific journals yet. And they're being made in often these, you know, pretty basement lab situations. So yeah, synthetic versus natural is a big deal to me. And it's not, I mean, I believe adults should be able to use drugs they want to use, but they should know what drugs they're using. So you need to be honest with your customers and say, like, we made this in a lab, or, we grew a plant and then we kind of squeezed out the oil. Totally different things.
And we are going to get into that, but there was one more note here I wanted to ask you that was in that story that said GW Pharmaceuticals was a British company that has used the cover of America's pot prohibition to go light years ahead of any other single company in developing pharmaceutical pot medicine, has won a number of American patents for the isolation and use of THCV as a medicine.
Yeah. Yeah, GW Pharma is, they're now owned by Jazz Pharmaceuticals. They got bought. But if you look up GW Pharma patents, they've patented like basically every cannabinoid there is, or that we know about. And they, these pharmaceutical companies get, a lot of bad stigma in the cannabis community for really good reason. But I think GW Pharma is a very mixed bag because in other ways, they got the first FDA approved drug approved, the one for seizures. And that's a huge deal to have a cannabis derived drug approved through the FDA. So
Epidiolex or whatever.
Yeah. So, and it's also just helping those kids, immensely. So that's a great thing. So, GW Pharma is, a complicated company. But they did do a lot of work and they're, it's complicated because I think there's also reasons to think GW Pharma is blocking more medical research because they have so many of these patents. They kind of like covered the field. No one else was looking into this in the 90s and the early 2000s when they were just like, bang, 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 block the whole field. And now you don't see as much investment in cannabis medicine, I think, partially because GW Pharma already really has a lot of it covered.
Okay. Let's go to the next one. We got 4 more here. I want to rip through these, Lester.
Yeah, I'll talk less.
And no, you're good. I just know you got some shit to do later, and I want to make sure we get to touch on all of these. And the next one is one that really caught my eye, which is how and this is again in 538, how Mitch McConnell accidentally created an unregulated THC market. And this is from October 18th, 2021. Will you give us a little start here? I got a couple questions, but I was wondering if you'd kick that off.
Yeah, so this one really ties into the hunting for rare cannabinoids because that hunting for rare cannabinoids was 6 months before the Farm Bill, and this is 3 years after the Farm Bill, and we see a totally different world where now federal government has legalized anything in cannabis other than Delta-9 THC. They wrote the dumbest definition you could have of cannabis. And what we did in this story is we talked to a fellow named Jonathan Miller, who former treasurer of Kentucky and a lawyer, and he was in McConnell's office when they were writing this bill. And he told me, on the record, like, we had no idea. We did not know that there was more in cannabis than Delta-9 THC. So the folks writing the Farm Bill thought cannabis was like alcohol, where alcohol is a single molecule drug, and cannabis, as basically anyone dealing with the plant knows, is a very complex drug with hundreds of active compounds. And they define cannabis simply by Delta-9 THC, but they wrote such a loose definition that you could really play around with this. And by 2021, when the story came out, we saw all sorts of crazy products. Delta-8 was just the beginning. These, Delta-9 THC, which is made from CBD synthetically. So they're saying it's not marijuana because it comes from CBD, is another one. And then even crazier ones like the THCO acetate type things, which are totally bathtub gin. Like, I think stay away, guys. That stuff is sketchy. And in this story, we actually bought these products and had them tested by a pretty great lab in Kentucky. And they found these mystery compounds. And it's truly a mystery. No one knows what these compounds are. It's not like they're finding THC in them. They're finding who knows what this is. And they also, with these THCO acetates, the actual ingredients can break down to other more dangerous things. And in this story, we brought up the theory. It was just theory at that time, but that THCO acetate could break down into ketones, which is like a almost nerve agent type chemical warfare compound. And then about a year after we published this story, Robert Strongen's lab in Oregon confirmed this. They bought THCO acetate vape pens, and they found that when heated, it produced ketones. You are inhaling like a nerve agent. And I think many people don't realize that. The people who are buying these things, are often buying them because it's one of the only things they can access cannabis with. But it's just McConnell he did not know what he was doing. He accidentally created this wild, intoxicating drug market with bathtub gin products. And it's a thing that I think we need to talk more about. I wish I could write more about it, because every day people are buying these products, and I'm really concerned what is happening to them when they consume them.
I'm also curious. It sounds like you've consumed some of them yourself, based on some of your stories, some Delta 8s and some.
Yeah, it's funny. In that hunting for rare cannabinoids, I was dabbing Delta 8 THC, and it was so unique. It's like, especially at that point in 2018, like I really had no idea cannabis could be so different. But to tell you the truth, like I would never do Delta 8 THC now. In 2018, I didn't know how they were making it. I was actually ignorant. I thought it was extracted from cannabis rather than synthesized from cannabinoids. And so knowing what I need to know now, like I would not consume Delta 8 THC, especially not inhaling. I think, if you're eating things, just because of how digestion works, you're a little bit safer. But inhaling things, we're inhaling things into the most delicate tissue in our body, and it goes directly into our bloodstream without going through our liver. So if there are problematic compounds in there, you're hitting directly to your blood, goes to your brain, goes to your heart. So I stay away from these now. But I'm also fortunate. I live in California, where we have like plentiful access to natural cannabis. And I know people who are living in states that don't, have these difficult decisions to make. And I would just say, be aware at least of what these products are.
And I do want to read this other quote here, and I think you've touched on some of this, but I want to read it directly. It says, chemists warn that these drugs can contain hazardous solvents, acids, and unknown compounds, which multiple scientists that I've had on my show have suggested that as well, including Chris Hudala from MCR Labs and Josh Schweider. And then it says, when 538 legally purchased hemp-derived THC products for testing, we found illegal levels of THC and a variety of mystery compounds that could not be identified. There are no federal safety testing requirements for these products. And while hemp companies occasionally publish test results, some brands have been caught using fake test documents.
Yeah. Fake test documents. That's like the first story I ever wrote about cannabis in 2016 was about how COAs and, labs in the cannabis world, can create bad data. And that's a story I'm still writing today. So yeah, we got to be worried. Even though you see like a certificate of analysis saying this cannabis product contains this, you really got to be skeptical of it to begin with. And then also, if you want to be safe, like look into that lab and see what that lab's known for, which is a terrible advice. Like we shouldn't be giving that advice to people. You should be able to trust things in this country. But when it comes to cannabis testing, you really can't.
And wasn't that supposed to be the whole thrust of this legal market, was we're going to have a safe and tested product? But another scientist whose name shall stay out of this said to me that it's not safe, it's compliant. They're just passing with the rules that the state has set, which doesn't necessarily imply that it's safe. It's just in line with what the state has said might be safe, which
yeah, 100%. I mean, like that's true, right? It's like even if you're a good operator, you're trying to follow the law. The law in this case might be wrong. Vitamin E acetate, a very harmful thing to inhale that we learned through the whole vape crisis. Yeah. It was legal in every state to put into a vape pen. So you could have a compliant product that contained vitamin E and could kill you. So it's important to know that, with cannabis, that the lawmakers are often ignorant, if not always ignorant. And just because it's compliant doesn't mean it's safe. Although, this story is complicated, like any good story, it's complicated. And there is very good evidence that the legal market is safer than the illicit market. And that's confirmed through every study I've ever seen comparing illicit market products to legal market products. You see fewer pesticides, fewer general quality assurance fails in the legal market versus the illicit market. It doesn't mean the legal market is 100% safe. There still are pesticides in the illegal market that shouldn't be there. But it's pretty clear that if you can buy legal cannabis, it's more likely to be safe than illicit cannabis.
I'm going to slap a comment here from LinkedIn user Lester. On behalf of medical cannabis patients in Connecticut, I want to thank you for picking up stories from our local news media and syndicating them on SF Gate. Barely anyone on the West Coast knows what goes on here, and what little they do know is likely attributable to your signal amplification. Much gratitude.
Nice. Thank you.
Cool. And I do want to read a comment here. I think this is from Kyle Boyar. It says
wow.
It's well established. Yeah, it's Kyle Boyar, University of California, San Diego Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research. He says it's well established how it works, but the problem is that a lot of people who are doing this are not trained on synthesis. They're just getting information off the internet and trying to see if it works. It's a bit worrisome and a little bit scary, and it really does seem like a cash grab for a lot of people right now because of the lack of oversight. Any thoughts on Kyle's?
First thoughts on Kyle. Kyle's like one of the smartest people in cannabis. So like everyone go follow him on his social accounts because you will learn a lot about cannabis by following him. And of course, he is completely right here. Like Delta 8 THC itself, if you have a pure Delta 8 THC that's been nothing else is in it, very likely to be very safe. There isn't like robust long-term data on it, but there's no reason to think it's unsafe. But what you buy when you buy a Delta 8 THC vape pen is not just Delta 8 THC. I've never seen any test results from a Delta 8 THC vape pen showing just Delta 8 THC. There's all of these small, weird little compounds that, again, I keep saying this, but science doesn't know about. They're brand new because the synthesis that's happening has not been done for a long time. And it's not been done by the big companies that would spend the money to really research what's happening. So you're getting other things. You're not just getting Delta 8 THC. And what Kyle said is also true. It's being done, in these budget lab situations, these budget companies who are trying to make money quickly. And it's not being overseen by really any government regulator. And even though I've been trashing the government for the last 40 minutes, it's still better to have some eyes on it than to have no eyes and just trust whatever, like John Doe, he's a good guy. He knows what he's doing. Well, I don't want to put things into my lungs just based on trusting someone who's trying to make money off a vape pen.
Word up. I'm going to go to the next one. What do we got? Is this the drug dealing execs in the LinkedIn story?
Yeah, this is the headline that got me in so much trouble last year.
Okay, why don't you tell us why? And this is from January 2nd, 2023. This is from SF Gate here. Drug dealing executives, how potheads fell in love with LinkedIn.
Yeah. Well, so I guess the story itself, one thing I have seen, I think probably everyone in this video has seen, is that LinkedIn has gotten really popular with cannabis. And that's really because LinkedIn was the first major social network to say, we're okay with cannabis. We're not going to shadow ban you or block you from talking about cannabis, which is really cool. And it's been a really powerful tool for me in my own journalism, is finding people, finding stories. So thank you, Microsoft. So LinkedIn, it's cannabis friendly, and it's only becoming more cannabis friendly. But in January, it wasn't quite as well known outside the cannabis circles. So I was like, we should really write a story about this. And one thing we do at SF Gate is we write headlines to try and get people to read stories, and that's important to us, both for the bottom line. For me to be able to maintain my job and do this work, I need to have readers, and it's also important just because if I do work really hard on a story, I want people to read it. It's kind of like if you were to be a restaurant and you're making the best steak sandwich in the world, you want people to eat it. You don't want it just to sit there. So we write headlines that are, trying to be as catchy as possible. And this one really rubbed people the wrong way in the cannabis community in ways that I was surprised by, actually. I've been smoking pot for a very long time, and I've been calling myself a pothead for a very long time. And I, have never really taken offense to it, but people were really mad that we used the word potheads, and drug dealing executives. I was surprised by that. And afterwards, Kyle Sherman, CEO and founder of FlowHub, which is a really interesting data company out of Colorado, like hardcore called me out on Twitter about it. And then I was like, hey man, let's talk about this. And to his immense credit, he hosted a LinkedIn live and we talked about it with like a bunch of other people who were mad about it. And it was a really interesting, good process for me to connect with folks. And at this point, like I'm not throwing pothead in stories, and especially not in headlines, without really thinking about it. I mean, I don't think I have put it in a story since then. I wouldn't say I would never, but I definitely am not doing it lightly. And then the other part, like the drug dealing executives, was interesting to me because a lot of people in cannabis don't like using the word drug with cannabis. And for me, you know, as a journalist, I like to describe reality as accurately as I can. And I don't know a better word to use for cannabis, you know, than drug. It's intoxicating. It's actually habit forming as well. It treats medical ailments. It's what I would call a drug. And if you're running a cannabis company that sells cannabis, like you're selling drugs. I think dealing is like a very, you know, there is a lot of stigma there, which I'm aware of, you know. And I think if we were to rewrite this story, I know we wouldn't use this headline, although we wouldn't change it because we don't change things we publish unless we need to, you know, legally or something. So it was a learning experience for me. But yeah, it was also, I think in the end, like just having that LinkedIn Live with Kyle and other folks on it, I think, you know, even when we have controversy and anger, you know, when we get together and talk together about it, I think we all can learn things and kind of, you know, improve the way we move through this world.
And I definitely have had a lot of friends here in Vermont who have had their Instagram accounts fucked up from just posting pictures of a flower that was grown in a legal state with a legal market, but for some reason, you know, and it's weird. Usually Facebook is a little tighter on that. I've noticed Instagram tends to let more stuff go, but it seems like LinkedIn for sure is letting basically everything go. I've posted a lot of
LinkedIn, people post like, hey, I've got like 50 pounds of trim. Who wants it? Like people are having like, it's a drug deal. Like people are drug dealing on LinkedIn. And like, I think that's great. I'm here for it. Like I definitely didn't write that story hoping LinkedIn would shut it down, and they didn't. But it's more just like as journalists, right? We write about what's happening in the world, and what was happening in the world is that people are dealing drugs on LinkedIn.
Well, and you know, it's funny you mentioned that because the other note I had was about this story you wrote about Dustin Hawksworth, who's been on the show from Fat Nugs magazine. Maybe
He's in that story,
yeah, maybe he was trying to facilitate a deal and got snapped off by LinkedIn.
Well, yeah, but Dustin, like, I asked him afterwards, like, hey, were you offended by that story? And he was like, I'm not offended by anything. And so, like, he had no problem with it at all. Yeah, ultimately, I think the story is like a good story. It's talking about how people are connecting and businesses are changing the way they look at cannabis, which is a good thing. So there you go.
Cool. What about this, bro? Cannabis is not a drug. Any thoughts on that, Woke Shaman? Thanks for tuning
Woke
in.
Shaman. Well, thanks for bringing that up, Woke Shaman. You're definitely like having a you know, an opinion that's shared by a lot of cannabis people, and I think it's okay to have a differing opinion, right? Like language changes, definitions change, and so I think it's totally fine for folks to be like, cannabis is not a drug. But I would say I haven't found any evidence to tell me otherwise, and that's coming from someone who uses cannabis almost every day and enjoys cannabis and researches cannabis. For me, it's a drug. For you, it might be something different.
Yo, and you know, every time I take a dab, I do kind of feel like I'm smoking crack.
I mean, the first time I saw people doing dabs, it was probably like 2014. I was like, what the fuck are they doing? Because that can't be pot. So it's pretty wild. I mean, yeah.
I kind of feel the same. I'm like, yo, it's a plant. But yo, and you start you know, turning it into like serious concentrate. I'm like, okay, this feels a little more drug like.
So it's opium, not a drug? Like opium's from a plant, like tobacco is not a drug. That's very much a plant, very, very minimally processed drug, plant drug. Drug, I think, you know, one of the things that, you know, this happens a lot, especially I think in the last probably 5-10 years, is that we want to change the world to make it better and to make it more accepting. And so folks think the way to do that is to ban you from saying certain things. And saying like we won't use the word drug anymore with cannabis, I don't think is going to do anything to reduce the stigma. I think it's only going to confuse people. And I think it's probably better to maybe change our ideas about drugs. And that is much harder than getting, on social media and getting mad at me for saying drug. It's much harder to change stigmas and re-educate people, not re-educate, but educate people. But from my perspective, I'm pretty passionate about us just having dialogue and us describing reality how it is. And right now, I think the word drug is pretty appropriate for cannabis.
Cool. I'm just going to leave this one more up here before we go to the next story. To me, all nature-based substance, not drugs, companion plants.
I like companion plant. That's like a great way to describe it. I think like Michael Pollan would like agree with you. Like these are companion plants. They've changed with us. We've changed with them. So I'm down with companion plant as well as drug.
Cool. All right, we're gonna do this next story. California pot industry facing extinction event. This is once again from sfgate.com. Updated May 23rd. I assume there was maybe a first version and you updated it, but this is May 23rd, 2023. Industry insiders are warning that hundreds of pot shops could go out of business this year.
Yeah, so this is like the main topic I've been writing about for the last year in California, because in California, we're seeing this real contraction event where a lot of cannabis businesses are going out of business. And it's been a long time coming. First the cannabis farms started going out of business probably about like 4 years ago. And then it went to manufacturers and distributors, and now it's hitting retailers. And now actually it's definitely hitting retailers. And now the really interesting thing is hitting the state government. The state government is not getting the tax revenue they are owed. So the lack of money has moved through the whole system now. And when we wrote this story, it was still talked about as this is coming. Everyone in the industry is saying like, hey, this is bad. People are going to really go out of business soon in the retail side. And this story was the first time anyone had published information about missing tax payments from retailers. We were the first to publish this data showing that, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but something like 15% of all retailers in the state did not pay their excise taxes during that May deadline. And this is very difficult because excise taxes, you need to pay them. The tax man always wants its money. And in California, cannabis businesses that don't pay their taxes on time face an immediate 50% penalty. So you can imagine how hard it is. If you can't make the $10 tax payment, how are you going to be able to make the $15 tax payment? How are you going to make the interest on that as it grows? And so this data was really troubling. And this is now it's just about a year old. And what we saw in the last month is a lot more confirmation that these businesses are actually out of business. And now there's something of like $750 million owed to the state from retailers that has not been paid and likely will never be paid because many of those retailers are now out of business. So big contraction event in California, very sad because a lot of people are losing money and losing their livelihoods in really difficult ways.
And I think the number was over 13% of California's retailers, or 265 pot shops, failed to make any tax payment by the May 1st deadline, according to the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration. And you said those businesses are now facing a 50% penalty on
top of the payment they couldn't pay. Yeah, it's pretty draconian, I think.
And you also said, I think in this story, the entire cannabis supply chain is facing this debt problem. Farmers are reporting never getting paid for thousands of dollars in product. Distributors say retailers don't pay them. And it started blacklisting some shops, and even the federal government is getting stiffed. And as you said earlier, the state's not receiving their tax dollars, which seemed like something they were very concerned.
Yeah, everyone's out of money when it comes to cannabis in California. So it's just it's tough, and it's honestly getting worse. I mean, like my interview after this call is with a business owner who just shut down their business, and this was a business that I thought thought they were thriving, and they just shut down. So it's a serious contraction event. It goes back to the first story we started about, right? Like legal weed is not a boom for small businesses. It's tough, and it's really like consequences are pretty dire for a lot of these folks too, because they've put so much money into it, so much of their time. In many cases, they've like cleared out their retirement accounts, they've attached to their homes, they've remortgaged things for it. And so it's a human story too. You know, it's not just a business story, it's a human story when so many people are struck with just such business difficulties.
This guy's Woke Shaman says they're using all the water in Fresno. I know Cali does.
Got plenty of water now, right? Like all the reservoirs are up. Crazy to see. Never would have thought I would have seen it, but 2 years of good winters has done well for California water.
All right. Excellent. And then we got the last story here, Lester. And I think we've touched on a number of threads that would tie into this, but this is, about, I bought a vape pen and, hey, broken system, banned pesticides keep showing up in California's legal pot. February 2020, 2024, sorry.
Yeah. So this story is, when we talk about doing stories just for clicks versus doing stories because they're important, like this is in the bucket of like just important stories, and doing this type of story is like an immense amount of work. Like getting through all this type of stuff that involved with this is hard. But what happened was, it's kind of hard to unwind this a little bit, but we found a vape pen in a cannabis store in San Francisco that contained a banned pesticide in it. And we had it tested by a really legitimate lab, and they confirmed that there was a banned pesticide in it. And that's, like not a good thing. We don't want banned pesticides in our products because pesticides can literally kill you, and they can also cause cancer and other really bad diseases. So we don't want that. But it was actually much worse, because this product had already been embargoed by the state, which is like a preliminary recall. And the state told the retailer, you cannot sell this product. And the retailer still sold the product. And the retailer has some excuses as to why they did. They had some miscommunications. They didn't know about it, which I think, is important to note. But it's also important to note that even when the state has very good reason to think a product is unsafe, it's still being sold. And we only found one vape pen, but there's, over $5 billion of cannabis sold every year in California. So if you find one vape pen like this, it's very unlikely to be the only one. So we confirmed this, really troubling stuff. And then we went to the state and trying to understand why the state has been unable to enforce these rules. And we found something even more troubling. And that's that the state of California currently cannot test for pesticides in cannabis products. That's nothing short of shocking, in my opinion, given that you have dozens of labs in the state of California, private labs, who are required by law to test for pesticides. You can't be a lab in California and not be able to test for pesticides, yet the state of California cannot test for pesticides. It's just really troubling. I actually reached out to them last week for a follow-up on this, and they still cannot test for pesticides. This is only a few months later, but it's a stunning sense of government failure. Being able to test for pesticides is not difficult. These private labs that set up and do it, can usually get set up in a matter of months with, it's not cheap. It's $1 or $2 million to set up these labs, but the state had now 6 years to learn how to test for pesticides, and they still can't. They've spent over $11 million building a lab that can test for barely anything. And you just have kind of a series of really problematic situations in California where it's a big question mark as to whether or not the state of California can test pesticide contamination in the legal cannabis market. And we're really going to keep writing about this. And this, honestly, like full circle, why do I write about cannabis? Because I'm a political reporter and I'm passionate about cannabis, and the world of cannabis has so many stories in it. This is a clear example of the politics of the government really failing to do something that by law they are required to do and they should be doing.
Yeah, and it really just brings me back to the same question about if this was supposed to be such a safe and tested product, boy, it really just seems like the people who came up with those rules might not have the scientific acumen to be making those calls. And it seems like some of the scientists don't either, because these are all new things that are just coming to light.
I mean, it's tough. It's like definitely a brand new product, and so it's hard. But all the scientists I talk to who are the experts in this world will tell you it's not that complicated to test for pesticides. And in fact, like cannabis can learn a lot from other things, and we've been testing foods for pesticides for decades. So it's very doable, and it's just any number of problems happening in California as to why they can't do it. And
well, if I recall from our conversation on the phone, you said California had one of the most rigorous tests for pesticides, where they were testing 20 something. But I've also from people, I've heard the expression of spraying around the test. Have you ever heard of that? Because it seems like there's a number of other things you could use that states aren't even testing for, which would be an easy way to sort of avoid getting caught for pesticides, using one they're not testing for.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really porous system where, like, if you can't trust the labs that are doing these tests, you can't really trust that they're pesticide-free products, because the labs could be doing things that would make it so you don't find the pesticide. Also, like farms could also, or grows could also be doing things that are bringing harmful contamination into it, and then not having that show up in the tests. There's all sorts of very established ways to make the market safer, and the states tend to not do those things. But cannabis is a unique thing. It's not the only consumer packaged good where these questions come up. And we don't see like the US milk supply being filled with like, well, actually, I don't want to talk too soon. I mean, there are like some problematic things in food, but like you don't see like such
Go ahead, dude. Yeah.
law breaking happening in other industries. And I think often in cannabis, the regulators especially, but even the operators sometimes don't take lessons from other industries that they could. And cannabis is unique, but it's not, it's not in like a different universe of things. So we can learn from other things. We can test for pesticides. We can make the market safe. We can regulate labs so that they are accurate. All of this is very possible. It's just a matter of, really wanting to do it, having the decision makers want to do it.
Word up. I'm about out of shit here, Lester. I did want to ask, did I ask you about the California, making the labs sort of revalidate their testing based on a state model? That's a
right. I mean, that's like one of the things the state has done, and it's actually not the regulators' fault. It's really the state lawmakers decided this was how we're going to do it. We're going to rewrite how everyone tests for THC, and I think all the evidence from that show that it's not working. There was a dip in THC potency, which maybe showed that inflation was coming down, but it's going back up. And from people much smarter than me, will tell you, you don't end fraud by telling people how to do something. You end fraud by watching them do it and secretly testing the results and enforcing the rules against them. But there's no quick fix. There's no like, hey, if you just add A plus B and get C, we're all good. Like everything will be good. No, you got to watch them add A plus B. You got to go retest their stuff. You have to be active in enforcement, especially in these early markets when things are, people still try and get away with what they can get away with. So this standardized method has cost an incredible amount of money for the state of California and the lab operators. They've spent a lot of money having to comply with it. And we still have a situation where there's very little trust in the results coming out of California labs.
And they're not even getting their tax revenue, which is...
they're not even getting their taxes, yeah.
Okay. Lester, I think that's about it. I'm going to leave it right here, man. I want to pull myself back up. And I want to thank you for being here, man. It's been a fantastic conversation. But before we get out of here, and I do have a new outro video. I wish you'd stick around for a minute after that so we could chat just for a second. But before I do that, if we missed anything or any shameless plugs or shout outs that you want to give, now would be the time, guys. It's Lester Black from sfgate.com, cannabis editor. Thank you so much for joining me today, Lester. Great talk, man.
Yeah, well, no, thanks for having me, Caleb. It's like really, it's really nice to talk through these stories because we spent a lot of time writing them, and it's kind of cool to go through and rehash what happened. So, thanks for having me. I would say to folks, watching, keep reading, keep commenting, tell me what I'm completely wrong about, and so I can get it a little more right. Follow me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place to find my stories and yell at me. But other than that, yeah, thanks for having me, Caleb.
My pleasure. Lester Black, sfgate.com, cannabis editor. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey. Remember, the devil's in the details, and the details are in the fine print.